this computer. Hope I have enough space for 3 hours of recording. And I'm going to turn the sound down on this one so there isn't a fight between the two. Okay, so let me see here. Actually, though, I'm trying to think. See, we want to have some sound on because we want to be able to hear when they ask questions. And so I'm just trying to think of the best way to do that. Maybe the best way to do that is to, let's mute yours.
Yeah, I muted mine.
Yeah, and then then I think that'll be okay. And then I'll turn mine all the way up so that, okay. So I think we're ready to look at this. So today we're going to have Thomas, Joel, Co, and Cole, and Caitlin all give presentations. We're going to try to keep it tight, 30 minutes or so, then 10 minutes talking. Then, you know, what you should do is while we're talking is between, you know, if the next person can kind of get their computer turned on and warmed up and ready to plug in. Just out of curiosity, Joe, what do you have a MacBook, right? Yeah, Cole, what do you have? MacBook. And Caitlin? Not here? Not here. Well, hopefully that will change. Okay. So basically, I have this adapter, and you can plug it into a USB-C. All right. Oh, and I see Noah's here. Welcome, Noah. So we're going to switch. I'm going to leave this one up here so that people can actually see this and see the class. Oops. And plug you in here. And let's see if this comes up. Okay, so now what's going on is yours is doing 2 screens. So either you can put it up there or you can turn on mirroring, whichever you prefer. Go into the displays. If you go into here, go to here and then go to system settings, yeah. And then type in display. There we go, right here. And if you say arrangement and then say mirror, that will
Okay, cool.
okay. And then again, it's, you know, you can do it now or afterwards, but don't forget to fill out the evaluation form on each person. Thank you for doing the ones from last week.
Oh, can you let me share the screen too?
Oh, right, yes. Yeah. That's a good point. Yes, don't forget to share your screen when you're up here. So you should log into Zoom before you come up so you're just ready to connect in.
All right.
Sorry. Decline. Okay.
So today I'm going to be talking about building a blockchain system using code-based cryptography. So I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit first about just the project itself, some background, mathematical background that we need for the project. I'm going to talk about the success criterion and software and hardware requirements, and the feasibility timeline and objectives, and then finally risks, new skills, and then racial and gender consideration. Okay, so before talking about what blockchain is, I'm just going to talk about like sort of some motivation and some use cases for why we need it. Most people tend to think of it, well, they think of it as like sort of synonymous with cryptocurrency, but there are, as people begin to use it more and more, they've started to realize that there are a lot of things that we could do with it. So, for example, you can store personal data like medical data in a decentralized manner, global trade, and then like infrastructure of certain markets. And as people begin to use it more and more, they are continuing to discover more and more applications of it. And it's still a relatively young topic of study, so there's always more room for growth. So here's just a little simple picture to sort of visualize what it looks like. Basically, it's a decentralized ledger in which everybody who participates in the ledger keeps a copy of it, and then they're able to send out information in such a way that anybody can access it. But sort of the benefit of using it is that it eliminates third parties. So when you're talking about like cryptocurrencies, for example, you don't have to use banks, which a lot of times makes it easier for people to, you know, communicate. And yeah, so it's very cool. And here's a little picture just showing sort of what like blocks will store, what sort of information they hold. So basically a blockchain is an ordered list of blocks, each of them containing a lot of information. So there's the timestamp for when it was created. Each block references the previous block's hash. And then each one stores their own current hash, which we'll talk more about that in a bit. And then it also will store the data. So if you're talking about like cryptocurrencies, for example, it's storing data for transactions, but it could be really anything. Okay, cool. So yeah, blockchain is a distributed ledger keeping track of transactions or other sorts of data, and everybody who is in the network has their own copy of it. It's an ordered list of blocks. Each is uniquely identified by its own cryptographic hash. Each block will reference the previous block, and participating nodes in the network can propagate new transaction information to all of the nodes, and they could sort of decide what they do with it. And then there are things that are called mining blocks, which what their goal is to basically when they receive a new transaction, they're trying to append new blocks to the ledger. And if they can successfully do this, they'll get a reward for it. This process takes a lot of computational power, and I'll talk more about what that means in a bit. We also have what's called consensus algorithms, which is when when somebody tries to create a new block, everybody in the blockchain needs to verify that it's correct, and we need to reach a consensus before we add it. And like I was just saying, nodes invest a lot of computing power to do this, and so we want to build the blockchain in such a way that it is more advantageous to join it than it is to try to attack it. And so that has a lot to do with like the computational power you invest into it and that sort of stuff. So here's a little picture showing what cryptographic hashing is. Hashing is a really important tool in cryptography. Basically what you're doing here is you're taking a text. You can sort of decide however much information you want to put there. In the case of, like in my implementation, the hash will take like the timestamp, transaction information, previous hash, all things like that. And you'll put it through the hash function and you'll get a fixed length string of just letters and numbers. So yeah, it's a way to take an arbitrarily large amount of data and then you get a fixed length string at the end. It's a one-way function, which means that it's computationally infeasible to invert it. So if you found the hash and you were trying to recover like the original information, it'd be really, really hard to do it. So it gives the blockchain more security. And also, yeah, changing one hash will result in the entire blockchain being invalid. So if somebody tries to tamper with the information, but all the other participants in the network notice it, they'll instantly recognize it as invalid and they won't deal with it anymore. Blockchain uses SHA-256 hashing, which is one of the more recent and secure algorithms. And I'll talk more about what this means later, but the computational difficulty of finding nonces, which is used in the process of mining, means that attackers have a hard time to break the blockchain. And here's just a picture. It's probably too small for you guys to see, but this is just showing like, if you have a string and you change like a tiny, tiny bit of information, like if you just change one letter, for example, your output is completely different. It's completely like there's nothing that's the same about it. And it sort of just shows if anybody tries to tamper with it, it'll be completely invalid. So proof of work and consensus is what's used to both reward people for mining successfully, and consensus is then used to establish the correctness and append new blocks to the ledger. So generating a new block requires a lot of computational power to find the correct nonce value. And the nonce, what it is, it's basically, it's this random number that you feed into the hashing function, and you keep incrementing it to a point in which you get the first n characters to be 0 if you have a fixed block difficulty n. So all the other information that you feed into the hash function is all fixed. So like if you change, like you can't change the timestamp, you can't change the previous hash, you can't change the transaction information because that would all make it invalid. The nonce is just something that you put in there that you can change as much as you want until you find the correct value for your hash function. All the nodes in the network are competing to find this value, and whoever gets it first will receive the reward for the mining. And then this is also more about how, like, it's much better for you to try to join the network than it is to try to attack, because if you have the computational resources to do it, then it's better to just collect the mining rewards than it is to try to invalidate the hash and alter the information. And yeah, like I was talking about earlier, the consensus algorithm means that all the blocks need to agree, or a majority of the blocks need to agree before we append a new block to the chain. And they do their own calculations to determine the accuracy of this. So this is just showing a little bit more about the nonce value, what it does. So if on the left, if you have like difficulty of 4, you need to keep incrementing this value over and over again until you get, when you hash it with all the other information, you get 4 zeros at the beginning. And once you have that, you can collect the mining reward. Obviously, if you have like a higher difficulty, like 8, that will take a lot longer, will take a lot more computational resources. And the last little bit of background that you need is public key cryptography. So the basic idea behind public key cryptography, if you don't know anything about it, is that you take these 2 keys, you have a public key and a private key, and they're linked together by like a difficult mathematical problem is easy to compute in one way, but a lot harder in the other. For example, like RSA is pretty much like one of the first ones, first public key crypto systems, and it's basically relies on how hard it is to factor really large composite numbers into their primes. And basically the way that it works is that anybody can encrypt the information using your own public key. So you're able to send anybody, like you're able to take any plain text, encrypt it into ciphertext, send it to anybody, but then the person themselves, they're only able to use the private key to decrypt it. And here's just a little simple picture showing what this means. So the keys are different, but they're mathematically linked by a one-way trapdoor function. And once you have your plain text there, you encrypt it using the public key that anybody can access. And then if somebody sees the ciphertext, if they're listening in on the channel, this would just be complete nonsense. And because of the difficulty of finding the private key, it should be impossible for them to recover the plain text. And then the person who holds their own private key is able to get the plain text back themselves. Okay, so how is this used though in the blockchain? So the public key of each node is uniquely identifies it, and it's also a way for people to send them rewards if they successfully mine blocks, and a way to propagate information throughout the network. The private key that each user has themselves is able to let them access the blockchain, so sort of like to access transaction information and things like that. And also, like what I was just talking about, this makes blockchain even more secure due to the difficulty of recovering the private key. Bitcoin uses a specific elliptic curve crypto system for this. And this is where my sort of new contribution of code-based cryptography will come in. So the Mikulicz crypto system is what I'm using. It's the most famous example of code-based cryptography. Basically, the idea behind it is that it relies on the difficulty of decoding a arbitrarily large linear code. So what will happen is you take like a generator matrix G, you scramble it with some really large other matrices, P and S, and then this G prime, in addition to the like error correction capability of the code, is what you make public. And then anybody, if they want to encrypt a message and send it to you, they'll like take their message, multiply it by the big matrix, add a certain number of errors into it, which is determined by the error correction capability of the code, send it back to the other person, and then they can just, because they just keep these matrices to themselves, that's their private key, then they're able to invert the matrices, multiply it back using those two, and then use a decoding algorithm to recover the plain text.
Where are the errors?
The errors? So
I mean, where are the errors removed? Yeah.
it'll be, well, that's what we use the decoding algorithm.
Okay,
at
that's
the
part
end.
of the coding.
Yes, because you determine a certain number of errors within the error correction capability of the code. And then when they have like multiplied by the other matrices, you just use the decoding algorithm and you can recover it. Yeah. So yeah, I pretty much was just talking about this earlier. The only other thing is that it's a big candidate for post-quantum cryptography. So certain other crypto systems like RSA or things like that, they're not resistant to quantum computers. So this is one that is. And this is why we're interested in looking at it. Okay, so I was going to talk a little bit about blockchain, the use of object-oriented design. This is obviously, if you were looking at like the pictures of blocks and blockchain itself, it's clear that it's very, useful to create classes and stuff like that. So the three ones I'm working with right now, and I'll probably add some more, would just be blockchain, and transactions. So block, it basically just keeps all the information that was in the little box picture from the beginning. So it keeps the previous hash, current hash, timestamp, transaction information, stuff like that. The most important methods or functions for it are calculate hash and mining the block. Blockchain basically just keeps a vector of the blocks and the block difficulty or the number of zeros that you need to get a desired hash, the transaction reward, blockchain size, and the vector of pending transactions. And finally, transaction just stores information of the transaction, so where it's from, where it's going to, and the amount in the transaction. So for the success criterion, the most important thing that I need to do is just get a functional blockchain running on the math department supercomputer. So in order to assess the success of this, what I plan to do is just check it versus other existing simulations, like ones that I found on GitHub and stuff, and sort of be able to assess the performance and the accuracy and, if they have all the same sort of features and that kind of thing. Additionally, I need to make sure that the implementation of the crypto system is correct. So I can also check that just by the accuracy of decoding and also checking it versus other existing implementations. And the biggest measure of success would just be efficiency. So I can just check runtimes and stuff like that on the supercomputer, see how it performs when I sort of try to scale it up. And yeah, like something of secondary importance is figure out how to simulate a real cryptocurrency and compare it versus others. This is something that I do more if time permits and that sort of thing. So for software and hardware requirements, the software I really just need is C++ and Magma. Also using GitHub as just a way for version control and stuff. I have lots of experience with both of these both in class and in research with Professor Iden. So it's more just figuring out how to piece it all together and working in a sort of complex object-oriented design environment. And yeah, another big thing that I need to work on is just figuring out how to move between these things. So implementing the crypto system is pretty easy in Magma because there are a lot of existing functions for it, but the classes are much easier to make in C++. So something to work on is just moving between them. And hardware, I need the Kenny Math supercomputer for Magma. And I also want to get the blockchain implemented on a larger scale to assess its performance there. So for the feasibility, the blockchain implementation shouldn't be too bad. A lot of people have simulations of it existing online. The biggest thing is like figuring out how realistic I can make it. So getting it working at a base level is not too bad, and I have a lot going in that part, but making it more realistic is obviously more of a challenge. So yeah, I can check what I have versus all of the simulations online. The implementation of Mechley's crypto system is much harder. Making it in C++ is pretty difficult, or making it in Magma and figuring out how to go between is also something that I need to do. Yeah. So for the timeline, for the first bit, I want to just try to work on the blockchain and make it work at a base level. So probably I want to try to implement it using another public key crypto system, just using other source files that I find online and making sure that it works properly. And after that, the next step would be to get the Mechley's crypto system working myself, and then substitute in the elliptic curve system for this. Next 2 weeks, giving myself some time to sort of clean everything up, work out existing problems, and trying to make the simulation as realistic as possible. So referring to other papers, comparing like versus Bitcoin, Ethereum, those papers, the original ones, and finally, assessing the performance of it, comparing it versus other people's simulations I was talking about earlier. So the risks, I think really the biggest risk is that the Mechley's crypto system can use up a lot of memory. The public key is really like a really large matrix. In the initial paper, which was written in the 70s, it asks for a rank 524 matrix. Obviously, since computers are a lot more powerful now, we want to make it probably a lot bigger than that. Standard public key crypto systems use much smaller keys, so RSA will just take a large integer. So yeah, obviously this is a lot bigger. So new skills, I was just mentioning earlier that I have a lot of experience with both Magma and C++. So it's more just trying to piece them all together and work at a pretty high level trying to do these things. Possible new skill would be using JSON files to store block information. I've saw a lot of people online using these things, and it's not something that I've looked into too much yet, but if I feel like it's useful, then yeah, I might use it. I did my math comps on GOPA codes, which are used in the Mechley's crypto system, so I have the theoretical knowledge for this topic, but more I have to focus on the actual implementation and making it all work together. And lastly, the racial and gender consideration. One of the biggest benefits of the blockchain that I talked about sort of at the beginning of the project was decentralization. So blockchain, it aims to take away the power from third-party entities like banks and give it all to the people participating in the nodes. So the only really thing needed to participate is just access to the network. And so as my project is a simulation, I'm trying to just think of modeling in the most equitable and fair way possible so that all you really need is access to the network. And yeah, that's everything.
All right. Thank you. What questions do you guys have? Anybody?
I don't really know how cryptocurrency works, but how would you compare what you're encrypting against Bitcoin and Ethereum?
I mean, so mine's really like a simulation of a blockchain more so than it is like actually a cryptocurrency, because there's a lot more you have to do for that. So yeah, it's at like a lower level, I guess. If that helps.
Hey, Thomas, can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
So my understanding is that a blockchain is a linked list, and where each node is a list of transactions. And I think that's what you were trying to say. And the link is created by the hash, right?
So the way that I have it implemented is that each it's like a vector of blocks, the blockchain, and then each of the blocks just stores the previous hash as just one of the members in the class.
Ah, I see.
Each block will have like a vector of transactions as well.
I see. So you have a block class.
Yeah. So I have blockchain, transaction classes.
Yeah, I see.
Maybe a few more if I feel like I need it, but at this point, yeah, those are the big three.
And so like you can introduce a new block if you find the hash of the last block. Is that right?
So it's basically you take in all like the new transaction information. You're hashing like a lot of stuff together. So there's like the previous hash, transaction information, timestamp, but then you're adding also the nonce value, which is just like a randomly incremented number until you get to the point where the first like certain number of characters are all zero. That's the
Okay.
Yeah.
I see. And that's what crypto mining is essentially, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Cool.
So, obviously, when you do a transaction, there's a fair amount of computation that has to be done. Who does that computation?
It's whoever's mining.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's made, like I think Bitcoin and stuff is made in such a way that the like block difficulty scales with like as the network progresses.
Mm-hmm.
So it should be like roughly the same amount of time to get like the same reward.
Right. So, but you're going to do all the work on Magma on the supercomputer. Is that correct?
Yeah. It's the thing is, I think implementing the Mechalease crypto system is much easier in Magma, but what I would need to do is figure out a way to like get the C++ program to run the Magma, get the information back in a text file, and then bring it all back, sort of.
So how comparatively, what sort of order of magnitude, what would be the time differential of running it on the server versus running it on, say, your laptop?
I guess it depends on the scale.
Yeah.
Like, because I could run it on my computer just if it's on a smaller scale, but the main reason I think is just making it larger.
So on your computer on Magma or just in straight C++?
Straight C++,
Yeah.
Yeah, because I don't have, I can only use like the online calculator, and that's very
Sure.
limited. Yeah.
Anybody else have something? So yeah, I think this is a really, relevant product because Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in general, and of course, public-private encryption, all of these things are increasingly important and are going to continue to grow. And basically are, probably over the next 10 to 20 years are going to completely redefine the realm of financial transactions.
So that it'll almost be recognizable from the day when we used to hand people, you know, dollar bills. All right, well, thank you very much. And, right. So, who's next? Yeah, Joe, come on forward. We'll plug you in and you're on Zoom and ready to share. Yeah, good.
I gotta jump on Zoom actually. I totally forgot about doing that.
So, yeah, we're doing good time wise. We'll come beyond in a second.
It's not wanting me to join.
Let's see here. There we go. And sharing should be enabled. All right, and let's plug you in. And then we got the same issue where it's, if you go to displays, yeah. You know, we don't know which side, there it is.
There we go.
Just double click on the ball, well, that'll work too, yeah, there you go. And then if you go way over to the right, there's a present button, okay, there is one there too, yeah. Good. Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Mhm.
Well, as my name says, I'm Joe Lucaccioni here, and my project is on adding a phase transition to the neutron star equation of state estimation models. And this will be under the advice of Professor Leslie Wade of the Kenyon Physics Department. So just a really quick overview is this will be done for the LIGO Scientific Collaboration. They have two really, really big detectors in both Livingston, Louisiana and Hannaford, Washington. And they're working alongside a third detector, the Virgo detector in Italy. So these detectors can detect gravitational waves. Some of those gravitational waves that can be detected are produced by binary neutron star mergers. We can use those gravitational waves produced by said binary neutron star mergers to limit the equation of state of the neutron star. And currently we have two existing parameterization models that we've used in published work already also. The only critique against them is that neither contain a phase transition in the equation of state, which based off theoretics of physics should exist. And yeah, we should be able to detect that. So let's just get down to the nitty gritty of the physics. What is a neutron star? So a neutron star is just the core of a high mass star that has died out. It's generally 1 to 3 times the mass of the sun, which we call the solar mass. And it's all compressed. That whole mass, 1 to 3 suns worth of mass, is compressed into something like the size of Manhattan. So only about 15 kilometers in radius. And it's pretty famous for a subgroup of them called pulsars. You might have heard them in the news. They come up from time to time. And that might just be another way you've heard of a neutron star, is this subgroup of super fast spinning ones called pulsars. And due to how high mass and dense they are, we have absolutely no ability to replicate them in a lab. So we can only get any data about them observationally and waiting for events to happen.
The presentation doesn't seem to be working on Zoom.
Doesn't shite.
It's like half on the screen. It's strange.
That's great.
Oh, it's because you're
because I'm plugged in.
I think you need to mirror your screen instead.
All right.
You know how to do that?
Is that better?
Yeah, that works.
Ta-da. It's because I shared it before we plugged it in, so
I
got
see.
confused. Ah. There we go. So what is a gravitational wave? So a gravitational wave is literally a wave of space-time. So in our universe, we live in, as you can see, three-dimensional space, you could say, where we have up and down is one dimension, forward and backwards is another, and left and right as your third dimension. And then there's one more dimension, time. We always move forward in time, but that doesn't mean it's not a dimension, that it's very much a very real physical dimension. Now let's make pretty much a cloth where we have space and then time as your two axes of cloth that you can then stretch and whatnot. Now try to shake it, you're gonna create waves. The problem is only super massive events such as two super dense neutron stars or the even denser, heavier, and mostly unknown black holes can create gravitational waves on a big enough scale that we can detect. So an analogy for explaining a gravitational wave is try imagining you have a single straw in a pool of water and you just start to spin it on itself. That in itself won't make any waves. Assuming you're doing it perfectly, probably aren't, but let's assume you are. You aren't going to create any waves by spinning a straw on itself in the water. Now start stirring that straw instead. That will start creating some waves in the water. Now try adding another straw next to it and stir the two straws together. You're going to get bigger waves that way. And that is why only neutron stars and black holes, they're the only heavy enough straws, and only when they're together can they create big enough waves that are detectable. Because these waves are so small, they're literally on the scale of a proton. They're smaller than an atom. That's how precise our detections have to be. Now, to the next part, what is an equation of state? This is what we're trying to parameterize and detect. So an equation of state is just any mathematical equation that relates the state variables of system. These are things like the pressure, the density, the temperature of the system. The most famous example you might have heard about is the ideal gas law. There's the chemistry version of it, PV equals nRT, or the physics version of it, PV equals the Boltzmann constant times NT. And so we can look here on the graph on the right. You can put all three of them into one sort of big old graph, or you can try and set one of the variables constant. So let's say we set temperature constant, then you get that little side graph on the top right where you have pressure, volume with multiple lines for each temperature. We're going to focus on that as we are going to be setting the temperature constant for a neutron star, as it is mostly homogeneous in temperature throughout due to how small and dense it is. And so we're pretty much going to be looking at that pressure volume, but instead of volume density, and then just take one of those lines. That's what we're going to be looking at for neutron stars. And so how do we get that signal from the binary neutron star gravitational waves? When two neutron stars start spinning around each other, they literally start to stretch each other due to their gravitational attraction to one another. And so we can see this in what we call a hard equation of state or a soft equation of state. To use an analogy to explain those two, imagine your gravity and you're pressing down on a ball. Imagine that ball is a basketball. You can't really squish that. No matter how much force you put in, you can't really change the shape and size of a basketball. That would be a hard equation of state. Now for a soft equation of state, imagine that ball is a foam ball. You're going to be squishing that down. You're going to get a much denser and smaller and compact ball than the basketball, the hard equation of state. So against your intuition, a soft equation of state is actually more compact than a hard equation of state due to the force of gravity. And so we can constrain the equation of state by looking at the tidal deformations in the mass of the stars, as a hard equation of state will cause bigger stars. So there will be more of an effect of gravity from its neighboring star, creating more tidal deformations, while a softer equation of state will be denser. So there will be less of a force of the gravity, as there's not as much area to cover pretty much. And so, as I explained in the overview, we have two existing models in published work. They are the piecewise polytrope and the spectral decomposition. The piecewise polytrope is just a collection of straight lines demarcated into 3 sections in log-log space, which is just a special kind of space. It's not Cartesian space, it's to the power of 10, sort of, in a way. And so, as you can look in the graph on the left, the piecewise polytrope, we have an injected model, which is the black line, and each sigma, pretty much how much are we containing within our estimation. 1 sigma being the least, 3 sigma being the most we're including. It gets really, starts to bulge at whenever there's joining densities. See if I can show this with my mouse. At the joining densities, we get some bulges. So it's not exactly ideal. We do not want that. And that's where the next model that was created, the spectral decomposition model, was made. And so as you can see, once again, with the joining densities, there is no bulge. So you think we solved that problem. And it tends to fit just better than the piecewise polytrope. But it still doesn't have a phase transition, nor is it able to handle a phase transition. So let's create a totally new estimation model. Let's go back to the polytrope, as those are just easier to work with and easier to understand. And let's make it a dynamic polytrope. So this will have 5 free floating parameters, pretty much variables that can change. This will be P1 in log space, P2 in log space, gamma 0, gamma 1, and gamma 2. Each of the gammas is just going to be what the slope is of the line in log space for each section. And so we're going to be setting a fixed sort of P0. This is going to be some fixed crust that we know and can tell through observations of actual neutron stars. It's the inner workings that we have no clue about. And so we're going to be fixing that at a similar point to spectral, so that we can compare this model to spectrals. And then we'll be leaving everything to free float, so it no longer will have those joining densities, and thus no longer have that accruement of error of joining density of a accruement of error at the joining densities that the previous piecewise polytrope model had. And so doing this, we hope we can then reduce that distance between the 2 joining pressures to model and replicate a phase transition in the equation of state. And so that's going to look like a sharp jump in density and not much of a change to no change at all in the pressure. And so that's where this letting those 2 free float really come into play, as we're then able to hopefully smush them right next to each other and say, hey, this means we have a phase transition. The only issue is, as it exists, everything else in our software cannot handle that at all. So how do we know we succeeded with this project? Well, first off, the full parameter space is explored. Pretty much what I mean by that is our model can pretty much work in the same exact area as the previous 2, spectral decomposition and the piecewise polytrope model could have, and it can recover the same sort of information. The next is that we can replicate that phase transition of an injected signal. So we'll take a signal, we'll set it so that it has a phase transition in it, and then we'll put that in our model and see if our parameter model will be able to pick up on the fact that there's a phase transition in it at all. And the final is to make the TOV file robust enough to handle any sort of corner case, anything that we think might happen that could be possible, or a TOV has to be able to handle that. The TOV is just kind of the grease that makes all the gears turn pretty much. But if it's not working, your gears are gonna get all clogged up, they aren't gonna turn, and something will break. We don't want that. That's horrible. That's very annoying. So what will we be needing to use? Well, first is access to LIGO's software package. This is on GitLab, and I do have access to that thanks to Professor Leslie Wade and Madeline Wade here in the Kenyon Physics Department, as they are part of the LIGO Scientific Collaboration. From there, I will have access to the LIGO computer clusters. They have a few of them, but the notable ones are the ones at the 2 detectors in Livingston, Louisiana, and Hanford, Washington, along with another at University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and a 4th at the California Institute of Technology. And the final little bit of hardware that we'll be using is Gimli and Legolas here at Kenyon. They are just 2 computers that we've named after Lord of the Rings characters that I will be doing most of my work on, as they are good local repositories that we can isolate from the rest of the LIGO systems, and thus we aren't affecting the LIGO code as a whole and working on our own local repository, even though we are already working on a GitLab fork. It's just best to keep it as separate as possible. So the timeline for this is we're going to first want to make sure that this polytrope, which is built already, it has to explore the full parameter space. We're pretty much there, but we're kind of hitting a couple errors and corner cases to prevent us from fully having that. And so after we get that, we then want to be able to inject a model that has a phase transition, and the polytrope doesn't just completely break. It doesn't necessarily have to detect the phase transition, just please don't break. Then would be detecting that phase transition and then distinguishing it in a way that's clear in our analysis data, that we can then tell, hey, the model is actually picking up this phase transition. It's not just working with the phase transition, it is picking up in a very clear, concise way and telling us, hey, there's a phase transition at this point. And the final would be then working through the TOV and making it robust enough to cover every possible corner case. The ones we can think of, the ones that we are hitting, the ones that we can't think of, and the ones we aren't hitting. We have to be able to cover any possibility. And that's what's going to be hard. So what are some risks with this? Well, one, it might just not work. We might never be able to get this to work with the TOV and with the rest of the LIGO Scientific Collaboration's data and software. It just might not mesh. We might just have to go, we tried, sucks. Let's try a different idea. Another problem and more concerning is if it's not made quite properly, it could yield misleading information, pretty much picking up phase transitions where there isn't, not picking up ones where there are. And when in an experimental setting at such a high level like this, that's a death sentence pretty much. You do not want any sort of misleading information. Others risks are like we might not be able to account for every corner case, perhaps because we just don't think of them, we never hit them, or maybe it's just impossible in our code to get it to run. We'll have to ignore some corner cases that are highly unlikely and just hope we never hit them. We don't know. It wouldn't be ideal, but it might be a compromise we have to make. And then there's also that we might yield conflicting results compared to current models. Now that might sound like what our goal is to yield one that has a phase transition compared to models that don't. But if we're getting something like just totally different than what our other models are picking up, they should be in the same area in terms of what they're picking up. Just ours will pick up a phase transition. But let's say we explore a line that is much higher in pressure than the other two models are thinking that the equation of state is at, that would be a confliction that we don't want to happen. We want them to be more or less the same pressure for density in the log pressure, log density space as the other two models, just picking up a phase transition if there is one. And so what skills are going to be needed for this? Well, this coding is going to be done primarily in C, but there will be a few Python things, mostly post-processing stuff for Python that allow us to visualize the data that we get. And then Linux to connect to all those computers and go through different repositories and whatnot. We'll also have to be able to use GitHub, GitLab, that sort of stuff, and be able to use forks and be able to merge our forks to keep them up to date and merge them with the actual main code if and when we get this working. And then there's going to be, we're going to have to understand LIGO's existing software package. It's constantly changing. You got to keep up on that. And you got to know what's changing to know if it affects your project or not. And then change your project to keep up with the changes of the main existing code. And we also have to understand the math behind the probability estimation techniques and the neutron star equation of state parameterization methods that currently exist, pretty much spectral and piecewise. And this is what's super important for making sure we don't get conflicting with either actual real data, getting misyielding information from our model, or conflicting with the current existing ones. And so just as a racial and gender statement, this project itself isn't confronting anything in terms of racial and gender issues, but it is important to note that for a long time in the scientific community as a whole, there's been a very much a, what's the word I used? I can't think of the word off the top of my head. Oppression and systemic oppression, that's what I was thinking of, sorry about that. Systemic oppression of both women and minority races. And this has put them down for a long time. And we've been washing over previous women and minorities, and sometimes both, achievements to prop up old white dudes, as per usual. And we got to keep that in mind, keep bringing the fact that we've done wrong, and keep that in mind every time we propose a new project to make sure we aren't continuing that oppression. And here's some references if you'd like to read more. They're very, very sciencey though, but I enjoy them.
Hey, you guys have questions, comments? Yes.
Maybe I missed it, but what are you considering a corner case?
So a corner case is just anything that might be possible, but highly unlikely. So let's look at either of these models. Pretty much anything that is covered in this area would be considered normal. But let's say we're picking up something in this area just outside of what we normally cover. Didn't mean to click. Just outside what we normally cover. That would be considered a corner case. That's something we don't expect to cover, but is technically possible.
So, so you're anticipating significant computational requirements to build these models, is that right? And you're going to be sending them off-site to these clusters, is that the plan?
No, the clusters is more just the computational part of it is that when we're going to be testing it and injecting, it's just faster if you have a lot of parallel runs because you're just going through a lot of data. And so while Gimli and Legolas each have a good chunk of cores, it's just more available at those clusters. So sometimes it's better to go to those clusters and use them. Though most of the work is going to be done on Gimli and Legolas.
And your models, will they be mostly built in C++ or Python?
They'll be mostly built in C.
Straight C, yeah.
Just straight C. The Python part is just for the post-processing. So after our models run and whatnot, we want to visualize them. We have the LIGO Scientific Collaboration has some Python scripts that can do that already. We just got to repurpose them and set them up so that our model works with those scripts.
And so, you know, what percentage of your project will be actually writing code versus doing other sorts of activities, just out of curiosity?
Most of it is going to be pretty much debugging code, pretty much.
Okay.
We have that 5-piece polytrope up and running,
Mhm.
and we have a good idea of how to get a phase transition to be able to get it picked up. But we just know that there's going to be a lot of bugs and issues and things we didn't realize we were going to have. So a lot of it is debugging.
So in searching for that, are you basically coming up with some sort of a pattern matching algorithm to look for certain?
No, it's a parameter. It's a probability density based parameter estimation, like a Monte Carlo Makarov chain.
Mhm.
That's the main one. We are trying to input a new one. I totally forget its name, but that's also a project I'm working on with Les besides this one,
Mhm.
of pretty much a new probability estimation, which is pretty much every point that we go to, it's given a probability of how likely it is to be true. And then it'll just randomly jump to one that's, if it's more probable, will stay. If less probable, we'll go back to the previous one and keep doing that. And then occasionally just randomly jump to a completely random point and do that again and over. And you'll eventually get this map of points where the more points there are, the more likely it is to be true. That's a probability density estimation. So pretty much you'll get a shaded region of a lot of points and then some not so shaded regions. That whole area is your likelihood. Like, let's say you have a chunk that has, in this case, 1 sigma worth of your points, which is about roughly 50% of your points is the red. So pretty much 50% of your points are contained within that red. Around 70% is contained between the green, and 90% is contained within the blue.
Mhm.
So that's more or less what a probability distribution is.
Interesting. So basically you're using a certain amount of sort of a randomizing approach to sort of discover.
To an extent, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's a really good technique when you have large data sets and it's too much work to basically evaluate every point, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you. Good work. Congratulations on that. And so I think Cole is next, right? So let's go ahead and get you. And are you able to go on? Good. See how this is doing. I've got plenty of battery power left. Just wanted to check.
So I'll also share screen, right?
Yes, please.
Does this show up?
Yeah, it does. I turned my, or is it? It's still loading. That's interesting. I wonder what's going on there. Let me see. Wonder what it's loading. What are you guys seeing?
It's just loading.
Yeah.
So
Huh.
Did you share before you plugged in?
No, I didn't. Should I do that? Maybe? Is
Well,
it the mirrored thing?
okay. So, okay.
I just tried mirror.
Screen, not sure what's going on here.
Was it up?
The screen sharing is paused. Oh, click
Oh.
on that and unpause it. That's probably what's going on. There we go. Okay, probably
Sorry.
just got accidentally clicked on. Thanks.
So
Yeah, you can store it in
the
this.
project is called Automating ADR and ORD Arbitrage Analysis. We're going to get into what those acronyms and arbitrage means. Next slides. Start by talking about the project background and goals. Here, I'm going to move this. So arbitrage as a strategy is, in a very general sense, it's a risk-free trading strategy that uses a large volume of rapid trades to profit off price discrepancies between similar or equivalent stock groups. The easiest example of this is with the S&P 500. So the S&P 500 is a bundle of 500 large cap stocks and companies, all just compiled into one index fund. So if you were to have a program that measures the sum of each of the individual 500 stocks versus the actual index value, if there are any differences between those are absolutely identical portfolios. So any price discrepancies you can expect to converge. So say, this is actually what this graph is showing. Over this window of time, I think it was in 2006, it was the biggest arbitrage gap that's ever been recorded between these two bundles. It's still only 40 cents, so it's very tiny. So if like the actual sum of the 500 stocks, say, amount to 2,500 and the S&P is sitting at 2,510, what you can do is you can take a short position on the actual index funds. So you're selling it preemptively while buying the actual sum of all 500 individual shares or stocks, taking a long position. Those are identical positions in inverse ways. So it's risk-free because no matter how the pair moves, you are going to be canceling out your profit and loss by the other position. And what you would expect to happen is for them to converge to, say, 2,505, and which nets you a $10 profit on that position. So that's just the gist of arbitrage. ADRs are American Depository Receipts, which are stocks traded on U.S. exchanges that represent foreign stocks exchanged on foreign exchanges, which are referred to as ORDs, or ordinary shares. So if, say, you have a company in Brazil that is locally traded on the Sao Paulo Stock Exchange, most people don't have immediate access to trade on the Sao Paulo Stock Exchange. So what they might do is they might buy the ADR for the same company, which is exchanged on NYSE or NASDAQ, something that's very accessible. And they usually represent fractions or certain proportions of the other complementary share. So an ADR might represent 4 of the ordinary shares on the Sao Paulo exchange, but adjusting for the magnitude of the prices, they are exactly identical stocks. So depository institutions are essentially bank intermediaries that allow people to transfer ADRs into ORDs, and that depository institution then sells it on the other side for them, or buys it on the other side for them if it's a short position. So the idea of ADR and ORD arbitrage is obviously there's a currency difference, usually. So if you have an ADR that represents exactly 1 ORD, and the exchange rate is exactly 1, just for convenience, and your depository rate of exchange is 5 cents, but the ADR is 6 cents more expensive than the ORD counterpart, then what you can do is you can buy the ORD, transfer it through a depository institution, spend 5 cents, and then sell it on an American market as an ADR and profit a penny every time you do that. So yeah, it's a very general overview of how it works. And what I'm going to be looking into are those tiny little price discrepancies that you can capture between ADRs and ORDs. So the problem to solve is that typically these arbitrage opportunities close in a matter of milliseconds. If they're popular forms of arbitrage, there's like a countless amount of types of arbitrage. ADR and ORD price discrepancies are a very unpopular pair because there are a lot of barriers to doing it well. The primary one being transaction speed. So the reason arbitrage opportunities are very few and far in between is because there are a lot of major financial institutions that pour a lot of money and resources into capturing every single penny that they can at the fastest time interval that they can to get a risk-free profit. But with ADR and ORDs, most places won't have like a New York bank is likely not going to have a fiber optic cable directly to a Sao Paulo exchange. So it's a little bit more of an even playing field, a little bit, not entirely. Yeah, still, it's on a slower time scale, but you still need a program to automate this technical analysis for you. Because if you're doing it by hand, it's hopeless. You want to be able to press a button and see a nominal sum of profit that you can attain. So I want to automate the data ingest, which I'm going to be using the Bloomberg API, the REST Rapid API for, and run all the technical analysis necessary to illustrate profitable price discrepancies between these stock pairs. And I want to show some sort of visual and numerical output that represents the exact price discrepancies and the profit windows that you can attain. And what I mean by that is I'm going to ask the user, there's going to be a certain amount of input on like what the depository rate that you have access to is, what your transaction speed is. They kind of give an idea of how much of the price discrepancy that's there you can actually capture. So I want to take in that information and then spit out some metric of how much money you can make off this, basically. Again, this is currency arbitrage. So most large financial institutions just pour a ton of money into this and act on it the fastest. Since it's risk-free, it's very aggressively fought for and it benefits the wealthy, which we'll talk more about later. So similar work. All of these major financial institutions that focus on arbitrage will have programs exactly like this. Well, not exactly like this. That will encompass broader forms of arbitrage, different strategies, and they'll be much more thorough in their analysis and much faster. But all of them are under black box conditions because obviously they don't want their competitors to find out what exactly their script looks like that's running this program. Because when it comes to that high level of analysis, it all comes down to latency programming, whether or not firm A has an algorithm that runs 0.000001 second faster than firm B. Because that difference makes firm A take all of the money from the opportunity and firm B is left dry. So because of this, I don't really have any prior work to work off of. It's pretty simple conceptually, but this project will be just a simplified kind of window into the arbitrage analysis that a lot of major institutions do. Now we'll go over the requirements, risks, and my plan for tackling this. So success conditions. I want it to be a very flexible program that you can input the ticker symbol for an ADR and ORD and the currency that trades between the two, and it'll work. I want it to be very flexible in that regard. I want there to be some intuitive output that shows a currency adjusted price movement for both stocks over top of each other. Just because, especially when it comes to price discrepancies, visual analysis is definitely the most helpful because it's very easy to see. I want to display some form of analysis of the persistence of price discrepancies. So, I mean, this could be like an absolute value of the actual separation that is capturable. This could be like a table of persistence intervals of the actual price discrepancies, the average time that they persist, stuff like that. It's kind of open-ended because there are a lot of things you could do. And then this last part is the most important, but also the most monstrous. I want to output some metric of profitability given depository rate and transaction speed. And the reason this in particular is open-ended is because there are, even within this specific type of arbitrage, there are plenty of strategies of capturing those price discrepancies. The one that I talked about earlier is called an immediate swap strategy. The other strategy that you could do is similar to the example with the S&P 500, where you take inverse positions on, the more expensive stock you're selling, the cheaper stock you're buying, and you wait for those price divergences to disappear, and then you sell or buy and cancel out your position. And then another thing to consider when thinking about profitability is whether or not the person using this program is a market maker or a market taker. So what that means is if you are some massive firm on Wall Street and there's a 40-cent price discrepancy between the S&P 500 and the actual bundle of 500 stocks, and you have a lot of resources at your disposal, you can trade a ton very quickly. You might pour like 100,000 trade requests into the market, and what that's going to do is change the price. So as you trade, the price is converging, and there's a whole lot more to consider because the profit that you're capturing is a little more obscured by the actual price movement, which all depends on how many other people are doing the same thing. So if you're a price maker, you can consider your actions to be affecting the market price directly, and not a lot of people are kind of matching your trades. If you're a price taker, you don't have to worry about that. So like, if it's one of us doing this and we're just a retail investor, we're probably maybe going to trade like tens of shares, which is not going to move the price at all, which simplifies the profitability window a little bit, which is definitely the first case I'm going to be looking at. So the base case of profitability metric that I'm aiming for is an immediate swap strategy. So that's, buy the cheaper, swap it through a depository institution, sell it at the more expensive side as a market taker. So price doesn't move as you do that. But again, it's open-ended because there's a lot you can do with this. Yes. Software requirements and resources. As I said before, access to the Bloomberg REST or Rapid API, which is just the easiest way to access historical financial data in like a compilable format. Jupyter Notebook with Python or PyQ. The reason I'm going to use a Jupyter Notebook specifically is because just with playing around with the Rapid API, it seems to have a pretty strict request limit. Obviously, it's a privatized API because so many major financial institutions want to pay for more information than their competitors. But for the basic version, there's 500 requests per month, which is pretty small. So Jupyter Notebook is going to be used so I can store the data frames without rerunning a script and redoing a request every single time I want to test my code. Professor Scott is my advisor, and we're going to work together to review the different project stages and hopefully get recommendations with any necessary expansions or adjustments to the project. And Professor Trieber is my economics major advisor, and I'm going to talk to him to discuss the trading strategies that I can model other than the immediate swap strategy and how to best approach profit analysis. Potential roadblocks. So this first one is going to be a big one. Getting data with small enough time intervals. Again, with preliminary work with the Rapid API, the free version seems to only give 5-minute time intervals, which is a very long time when you're looking at arbitrage. Once again, though, this is a very unpopular form of arbitrage. So if I find like very obscure stock pairs, there may still be visible and capturable price discrepancies. But my hope is definitely to get that down at least to the minute scale, preferably the second scale. This is an example of, it's very blurry, but this is exactly what I was talking about with the S&P example. This is again, the dark blue line is the S&P index fund, and the kind of turquoise line is the bundle of 500 stocks. And this is on the second scale. It's hard to see, but the price discrepancies are pretty close, and they correlate. The gap between is likely just transaction fees that stack up if you are trying to capture this, so there's natural separation sometimes. But on the millisecond scale, it's much more varied, so you'll have gaps that can be explained by transaction costs, but you'll also have these massive gaps that only occur for a few like microseconds that high frequency trading firms can capture. Python data frame manipulation. I just throw this up as a roadblock just because I've never worked with it. Most of my data wrangling experiences with KDB Plus, or Q, or SQL. I haven't really worked with pandas that much. Another roadblock is working with JSON data in Python. Bloomberg operates exclusively in JSON objects, which is just, it's kind of funky. I'll have to learn a bit more about it so that I can dump it into a pandas data frame. So this is my timeline. I'm hoping by next Monday to have successful or acceptable data ingest, whether that be a faster time intervals on a smaller time scale, or just I'm able to find illiquid pairs that are traded few enough and are obscure enough that price discrepancies persist over the minute time scale. So I want that done by next Monday, and then 2 weeks from that day, I want to have some pretty fleshed out price divergence and convergence analysis. Those are going to be likely static, pretty simple graphs and tables that I produce, but that's kind of the foundation of all the data that I'm going to be using for the profit analysis. So I want that step to be very thorough. 2 weeks from then, I want to start looking at profit windows and nominal sums of profit that you can actually capture. And then 2 weeks from that, I want to have a fully fleshed out profit potential analysis. And that's considering transaction speed and depository rate. That's giving a nominal lump sum over a time period that you might be able to capture if everything goes smoothly, and then potential backtester work. So I kind of threw this on as just kind of the light at the end of the tunnel. If this goes smoothly and everything works out as planned, I would love to build a backtester or implement an existing one to model this trade and actually see like if you were using this trade strategy with this exact transaction speed and depository rate, yesterday, would you have made any money? Would it have gone south because you're not trading fast enough? Or would you have actually made risk-free money. And so late April, I said successful backtester or any necessary expansions. The backtester is kind of just a cherry on top if I get there, because they are behemoths, especially because you have to make a separate one for every single trading strategy, which is annoying, but yes. New skills required. I need to learn about Python API requests to dump the data from Bloomberg into Jupyter Notebook script. JSON object manipulation, that's just to help me data wrangle and get everything named out. Python pandas library expertise, or KDB plus Q. I might use a PyQ script instead of a Python script if I find it to be easier, but one or the other. And then Python plotting libraries. I've never really gotten any practice with them, but especially for static graphs, they are going to be a very attainable skill to learn. That's going to be the bulk of my kind of visual analysis of profit or price divergences. Prioritized objectives, again, getting the data ingest and having acceptable data. I give it probably weeks worth of work. Visual supplements to price divergence and convergence, and the persistence of those separations, probably another week or two. That's going to be a very simple step. And the main bulk of the project is going to be the supplements to profit analysis, whether that be like flexible profit analysis so that I can model profit windows for a market maker versus a market taker, or for a different strategy, or building a back tester. Again, it's open-ended because there's a lot I could do and a lot I want to do, but I at least want the basic example of immediate swap market taker strategy. And racial and gender equity consideration. Arbitrage is like kind of the epitome of like a very oppressive strategy in the financial services industry. I mean, the industry is already dominated by straight cis white men, and arbitrage requires an enormous amount of resources just to start. So it's a richer strategy for those who are already atop systems of oppression. And I mean, it's just not efficient. Like the amount of resources every year, it's like trillions of dollars are devoted just to arbitrage, which is crazy. And I mean, it all goes to the fastest firm. I mean, it's terrible. It provides market liquidity is the argument for it being good, but I question that. This project doesn't do anything beyond bringing awareness to the dangers of the financial services industry. At best, it can be a window into the mysterious black box that gets billions upon billions of dollars poured into every year. This project will definitely not go deep enough to be valuable to any of these institutions, but although it doesn't accelerate the problem, it is not part of the solution. And these are just some stats. 90% of professionals in the C-suite of the financial services industry are white, and 71% are male identifying, and only 2% are women of color. So it is not a very diverse field. So yeah, that's just my email if you want to provide suggestions.
Well, thank you. What kind of comments do we have here? Questions? Yes.
You mentioned that arbitrage is risk-free, so there's no way to lose money on it?
So there is definitely. It's risk-free in theory, I guess is the right way to put it. So if you, theoretically, in a perfect world, if you do it well or correctly, it is risk-free. because you'll either be taking counter positions, or you'll be moving at a transaction speed at which you can close your positions before any prices converge. But in actuality, this is kind of what I hope to tackle with the profit analysis is if your transaction speed's too slow, say a user's transaction speed was 10 seconds and at time t, there was a 5-cent price gap that they were going to be able to capture. And based on historical movements, that price gap probably won't close in 10 seconds, so they'll be able to trade and make a nice profit off of it. However, if they submit the trade or try to buy or sell whatever position it is, and the price suddenly converges and it disappears, they still incur the transaction costs, so they'll still pay the depository rates, and they'll just lose money. So that's where transaction speed comes into play hugely. But yeah, theoretically, it's a risk-free strategy. In actuality, it's definitely not.
So what do you think the resolution is to be successful, the time resolution necessary to actually really be successful?
Like the time windows that I'll have to look at?
Right. Yeah.
So it's kind of weird. I've done a little bit of looking into, I've made some preliminary requests to the API, and I have found some pairs that do seem to have persistent price discrepancies even over like 5-minute periods, which is weird. And if this were a very common form of arbitrage, that would just be assumed wrong, and you would have to look at the millisecond timescale or the second timescale. But this is a very obscure type of arbitrage because a lot of financial institutions have access to the exact same depository rate as retail investors, which is the main push for them not taking up the space of arbitrage. And two, they don't have fiber optic cables plugging into foreign exchanges, so they also have similar transaction speeds to the rest of the population. Yeah, so maybe 5 minutes is enough, but it'll take some playing around with data to figure out whether or not that's viable.
So what do you see as some of the ethical issues with this technique for making money?
It's terrible. I mean, like, to be blunt, it's absolutely atrocious. Like, a lot of financial institutions will have desks devoted to arbitrage, where they're paying people 6-figure salaries to spend all days building programs like these that will maybe net the firm like a few $1 million, and at the cost of any retail investors being able to access the same type of profit.
Right.
And yeah, it doesn't do much for the market either. The argument is that it provides liquidity because having a lot of high frequency traders constantly submitting orders for stocks so that they don't have price discrepancies, it allows retail investors to get their orders filled much quicker because the market finds a buyer and a seller before any transactions can happen. But there have been studies that have showed like arbitrage liquidity, or the additional liquidity in the market gained by arbitrage is nowhere near what a lot of financial institutions argue it actually is. So yeah, it's definitely not a very ethical trading strategy.
Yeah, it's interesting. About 10 years ago, a student of mine, upon receiving his PhD, he was immediately given an offer from some stock exchange related company in New York City, offering him right out of graduate school $250,000 a year.
Jeez.
Right, I don't think he was doing arbitrage, but basically used machine learning and such to try to be able to capture market trends in real time and exploit that. And he didn't do that, by the way. He's actually a high-level person now at Microsoft. you know, the temptation is there to find ways of sort of gaming the system, right? To make a quick money, you know, which is, it's interesting to me because, I mean, in terms of, you're basically just skimming money. You're not actually producing anything, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because when you do traditional buying and selling on the marketplace, you're contributing, right? You're assuming a certain amount of risk, and you're giving money to a company in hopes that they will be able to use that money to improve the performance of that company, right? And this is something completely different.
Yeah, totally.
Anybody else? Thank you. That, you know, it's really, really interesting, isn't it? I mean, these are a broad set of topics, and, you know, to be able to hear these and to think about, you know, some of the ways we can take this, and these are us, you know, some of us are physicists, economists, ethicists, right? And, you know, to be able to sort of hear this, I hope is meaningful for you guys. And also, you know, encouraging for you as we, you know, consider the progress and moving forward on our projects. Now, is Caitlin, are you here? She's not in here. Are you online by chance?
Yeah, I'm right here.
Okay, I wasn't sure if you were here. Are you ready to go?
Yeah, I'm ready whenever you are.
Yes.
Okay, good. Let me share my screen.
So what I need to do is I'm going to reconnect a few things on this end to get you on our screen.
Oh, okay, perfect.
And let's see if this works. And my battery's still holding out and I'm still recording. If this will just, there we go. Let me see here, it's making some progress, yes. So yeah, try to show your screen and let's see what happens.
Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's really small, but I'm hoping that once you,
Is that better?
well, I need to, it's, okay, I've got to figure out how to get this to full screen on my side. Because it's very small. What am I doing wrong? So I'm guessing we might have to, okay, wait. I mean, we can see it, it's just, it's not optimal because I'm making it as big as I can. I think that's as big as we can go. Okay, I think that'll.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, hi everyone. I hope you can hear me and see me. But so my project is going to be looking closely at calcium dysregulation within the astrocytes in the central nervous system, and specifically the IP3 receptor. So my question for this project is going to be, does calcium dysregulation within the IP3R link to autism spectrum disorder? So first, let's talk a little bit about the astrocytes and their role within our nervous system. An astrocyte is a certain cell type that is in the central nervous system, and it aids in axon guidance and synaptic support, which it helps kind of maintain and regulate our synapses for our neurons in our brain, which is pretty important. It also regulates blood flow and supports the blood-brain barrier, which is very important too, because the blood-brain barrier kind of tells what can and can't go into your brain through blood flow. So that is very important. It's known right now that they go through structural changes and protein expression changes for certain diseases like Alzheimer's disease, epilepsy, schizophrenia, and depression. But it is not known whether this kind of structural change represents a reaction to an injury, where the astrocyte is kind of trying to support neurons in an attempt to prevent further injury, or whether the astrocyte is providing detrimental signals that contribute to this disorder. So also calcium oscillations within our nervous system, the role of calcium is very important. There are oscillations that are created throughout the astrocyte as it enters and exits the cell. And this is a very normal aspect of life and really important. So any kind of dysregulation somewhere will cause some issues, and it could be an excess or not enough calcium in the cells that can lead to different kind of issues. So calcium is a messenger within the central nervous system, and it regulates very basic but really important activities of the cell. And it contributes to the transmission of the depolarizing signal in synaptic activity, which makes sense because that was, as I said before, one of astrocytes' main functions, that is. So it's kind of known that an issue in calcium oscillations within our astrocytes can cause different things, but no one really knows what or like where in the cell because it's so small, or why. So also we'll kind of have a background on autism spectrum disorder, or ASD as I call it a lot in this presentation. This is a developmental condition which causes different challenges in social interactions, speech, nonverbal communications, and different behavioral problems like repetitive behaviors or emotional issues as well. The symptoms all kind of vary from person to person that are diagnosed, as it is on a spectrum. So there's a lot of differences between people. And there are also a lot of comorbid disorders that come along with it, or it comes along with. So there's a lot going on in this disorder. The diagnosis in autism has gone up a lot recently. And now, I guess in the past 50 years, there's been a lot more diagnosing going on. And now it affects 1 in 59 children. And the average age of this diagnosis is 4. And that is pretty delayed because it's defined just solely on different behavioral qualities. So that's very age dependent. So it can be kind of an issue when kids aren't diagnosed until they're older, on the older side. So for a long time now, they've been trying to find more biomarkers in our bodies to kind of see if you have autism without having to wait until you get older and see the behavioral changes. So to tie this all together for my project, I'm looking to see if there's a link between this calcium dysregulation and autism. There's also a documented mitochondrial dysfunction in autism, so that has been recorded for a while now. But not really sure if a difference in calcium signaling has to do with that. And the IP3 receptor probably has some kind of deficiency while transmitting calcium signals to the mitochondria. So that might be a possible issue that I'm going to look closely at. And the big question is, how can these differences in oscillations within the autism model lead to a possible causal effect or link between these two things? So my objectives for this, I'll be investigating the effects that calcium dysregulation in the astrocytes may have on autism. Like I said, there's a link. So doing a lot of research on how these it's lightly researched, so kind of reading papers to see how much research has been done on it so far. The points here with stars are my prioritized objectives. They're more important, but being able to find a normal human model, which I have, and being able to compare this with an autism model that I will predict, that is one of the big objectives to get over with. And then these models will be numerically integrated with Berkeley Madonna, which is the software I'll be using. So in the end, hopefully I can find these differences over time between the two different models. And that is a priority, but it might not happen. So that's kind of iffy so far. So the benchmarks right now, like, it's fully understanding the calcium signaling pathway and numerical integration methods that are being used. And to find that experimental graphic that represents the calcium change over time in autism for that comparison. And Huart cell will be used kind of as a control model, which I'll show you in the next slide, in order to compare and contrast these different simulations and computations in order to come to a conclusion. So this is Huart cell. It's kind of the control that I'll be using. It's like some normal cell, and how the calcium signaling kind of goes through. You can see that a signal will go in through a certain receptor. There's also a beta receptor over here that it can go in. It can go in and out of the cell through permeability issues. So it's adding in through all these places. There's lots of calcium going in. Here's an IP3 receptor. Oops. IP3 receptor here that is causing calcium to come into the cell. Over here, there's calcium coming into the endoplasmic reticulum. And it also it will go out through this receptor, which also has an IP3 receptor on it. So this is kind of complicated, but these have different equations along with them and numbers that will show as the control for comparison. So this is the possible autism cell model that I'll be using to look at mitochondrial dysfunction. As you can see over here, there are different channels and pumps that kind of bring calcium into the cell. Over here, there's another pump that brings calcium into the endoplasmic reticulum, which stores calcium. And once this has too much calcium in it, it'll pump through this IP3 receptor, which we're looking at, with some different proteins and channels that help bring it into the mitochondria. So this is what they think right here is what we're thinking is that the IP3 receptor has some kind of issue with passing these calciums through. And that is kind of what we're going to be looking at and trying to find a number for this IP3 receptor to compare with. So in terms of software, I'll be using something called Berkeley Madonna. And obviously I'll need Berkeley Madonna on my laptop, which I do have. Also, there is a manual that's where I got Huart cell. So it uses that kind of idea to introduce all of the numerical integration and different rate laws and equations for different calcium or like any kind of chemical signaling. So also I will need an understanding of Euler's method and Rosenbrock's method. Euler's method is more of a basic numerical integration method, but Rosenbrock's will be what I'm using for this because it's a little more accurate. Then I'll need to find some rate laws and equations for the control model, which I basically have, and kind of try to do some math within the autism model to find the changes in those rate laws and equations within that cell and like where kind of numbers will change for the equations. Cheryl Hemkin is my advisor. She has a lot of experience in using Berkeley Madonna and doing this kind of research. So she is going to be very helpful in this. And I was going to show you guys Berkeley Madonna as well because it is a little different, I think. Okay. So here is Berkeley Madonna. You don't have to look at this yet, but over here on the left, I'm just going to show you a basic chemistry reaction with an enzyme substrate. So the method I'm using is Rosenbrock's or stiff method. We're going to start at 0 down here and go to 10. So that's kind of the stop time or start time, stop time, which doesn't have like exact units on it, but it's just a thing. And then DT max is the step size that we're using for this integration. And 0.02 is kind of, I think, what they use a lot in this equations. Like every time you calculate, it'll be every 0.02 seconds. So down here in the middle, we have our differential equations for our enzyme substrate, and product. You can see them right here. They're all the differential equations for their rates and the rate laws. Then we put on our initial concentrations for each product that we have here. And down here is also the K's are rate constants. Forward and reverse reactions, they're different constants for the rates. So I'll run this. Oops. And you can kind of see that the enzyme is in black, and it starts at 10, but it's going down and it's being kind of used. The enzyme substrate is what is produced temporarily, and then it goes away eventually as well. The substrate is the reactant that the enzyme is reacting with, and that is in red up here, and it's kind of on this side with its units. And that is being used slowly, and the product is in green, and that's also slowly kind of being formed. And so if we increase the time to 300, we'll kind of see like a full reaction for this, sorry. And so this is like a full reaction of it. And so you can see the enzyme is black. At first it went down and it's coming back up until it's back completely. The product was completely made until it got to 100, and then it stopped there. And then the enzyme substrate, like I said before, is made and then temporarily used while the reaction is going and goes back to 0. And the substrate is the reactant, so is going to be used up completely down to 0. And so you can see how when we're talking about calcium entering and exiting the cell, there are going to be a lot of ups and downs and differences in different areas of the cell. So this is how we're going to measure out those different oscillations. So hopefully that kind of made sense. That's just like a really brief introduction to Berkeley Madonna. Okay, so that is my software requirements. Hopefully a lot of this is going to be a lot of new information for me, already has been, but obviously I've never used Berkeley Madonna before, so that's going to be a new skill to learn. I've taken calculus, but a long time ago in high school, so this stuff, numerical integration and the different methods being used, is also something I need to kind of catch up on. Also making these rate laws and equations and predicting models with these. A lot of chemistry is being done there, and I also haven't taken that in a few years. So there's a lot of chemistry and calculus that I'll be kind of learning and getting a hold of. I do have background in neuroscience because that's my major, so the astrocytes part is easier to understand for me, but everything else is kind of new. So those will be some of the new skills that I'm going to learn. Okay, so here's my development strategy and kind of the timeline of it all. So for right now, I've been doing a lot of research in the astrocytes and calcium signaling pathways, how those kind of work. Then reading up on different newfound research of autism links with calcium concentrations and signaling. And also, of course, learning Berkeley Madonna and how to use that as well. So I've been doing that all of February. I'm still kind of doing it, but now I have found a cell model that I can kind of use and base my research off of. So I'm starting with my advisor to design this model for the simulations that we'll be running on those calcium oscillations. So designing that will go for a little bit, however long it is, maybe around March 15th-ish. And hopefully that will be easier to design so that we can compute and test this on Berkeley Madonna. And then we can run both models that are created and then finally be able to kind of compare and come to a conclusion and final solutions after that. Around, of course, April 12th, because this is due. So there are some risks, of course, with not being able to find the correct numbers within autism cells to modify these rate laws. That's kind of what we're looking at now. You have to make sure that if there's an increase in calcium, like too much calcium or not enough calcium, kind of what we're looking for there, whether there's 10 times too much or 10 times too little, or like 100 times. So we're kind of figuring out those numbers and putting those into equations. So also these predictions can be very off sometimes. All of this is going to be predicted since it's kind of impossible to do it experimentally right now. Everything's very microscopic and can't really totally look at these reactions. So everything's kind of predicted, and there's always kind of a risk with doing that. And in the end, there may not be a measurable difference between the two cells that I designed. So hopefully there will be, but there's always that risk that it can't be. There isn't one. Okay, and the final note, taking into consideration racial and gender equity. Recently, kind of since in the past 10 years-ish, there's been a lot of issues with gender differences in autism diagnoses. So for a while, autism was only really diagnosed in males because males and females present their symptoms in very different ways sometimes for autism, especially when they're high functioning. And so back when it was kind of known as a disorder and created almost, the textbook symptoms of autism became those of the males. And so when diagnosing females and males, the males were diagnosed because obviously they showed their symptoms the same way as everyone else does. But the females, this caused them to kind of be overlooked or misdiagnosed. And there's also a lot of racial and ethnic disparities within the diagnosis as well. Black and Hispanic children are significantly less likely to be documented with autism. And so that's kind of been a socioeconomic issue as well. And keeping that in consideration will also be very important in my project. And yes, thank you. I think that's it.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. So, comment? Probably something that most of us know less about than a lot of some of these other ones, right? So it looks pretty complicated. I mean, I think that it sounds like you have a lot of new skills to acquire. And,
Yeah.
right, and so I think that's a part of your risk, right? Is that when you don't have a skill, sometimes you might not be able to correctly estimate effort based on a skill that you don't have yet. And so be aware of that as you're learning. You may have to adjust your objectives sort of to match the possibilities that are emerging, right? And we all deal with that, right? So, as we talked about the first day of class, there's uncertainty, and we have to be prepared for the uncertainty that's going to arise, and then adjust. And I encourage you to, if you encounter significant barriers that are going to require you to sort of, modify your objectives or go perhaps in different directions, or maybe even scale back some of your ambitions, let me know, let's talk about it. And, don't feel like that's not an acceptable
thing to happen, right? That's what happens. And what we want to discover in this project and in this process is what we can do. And we want to be successful in the least sense, in an investigation where we have discovered something, right? And we have built something. And we have grown as scientists and as people who utilize computation in the various realms that we're engaging in. So, any questions on this one? Okay, well, thank you, Caitlin, and thank you all for coming to class today. We will, of course, have 4 more next week. You know, again, please feel free to come to my office hours if you have any issues. Some of you are a little more dependent on me in terms of technology, and I'm available to help you with that. Others, like Caitlin, are working in domains that I have no background in. So I'm probably not going to be very helpful in a technical sense, but I'm still available to talk and hopefully, you know, lend my advice if you need it. So enjoy the rest of your evening and stay safe and take care. So see you guys later.
Thank you, Professor.
All right.